Is it possible you won't be able to feed your family in a decade or two? We'll dig into that subject and find out if we can dig our way out on this episode of Growth Busters.
Calling. Call the Growth Buster. Whoa.
Welcome to the Growth Busters podcast. Here, we discuss our society's addiction to growth, and we do our best to chart a sustainable course for human civilization. Now, on a full planet, that means it's time we stop expanding the scale of the human enterprise. We're talking about both our numbers and the size of our economy. And of course, that includes exploring ways to shrink our own individual footprints. I'm Dave Gardner, director of the documentary Growth Busters Hooked on Growth. For cutting-edge information about our culture's unsustainable love affair with growth and what we can do about it, visit growthbusters.org. Now, you may have noticed that my co-host, Grace, has been missing in action for several episodes now. Well, that's because she was with child and approaching the due date. I'm pretty excited to share with you that congratulations are now in order. Grace is a new mother. As every parent knows, she has her hands full now for quite a while. And while I'd love to have her back, I'm not holding my breath. It might be a while. So we've decided to audition for a new co-host. Now, this might be a long-term replacement for Grace, or it could just be a short-term replacement and a long-term addition. There's no reason why we couldn't have 3 co-hosts if this all works out. If you're interested in applying, shoot an email telling us why to podcast@growthbusters.org. By the way, it's not a paying gig. We'll pay you just as much as we pay me and Grace. That email again is podcast@growthbusters.org. I've only got time to share one of the several fine comments I got about our last episode, episode 26, Running Out of Gas. I wish I had time to share more. You can see a few of them at the episode's page at growthbusters.org. I'll have a link to that episode in the show notes for this episode. But let me just read one of these comments that I thought was very interesting. This is from Heinz in Victoria, Australia. Heinz wrote, "Outstanding podcast, Dave, James, and Paul. All of it very relevant. I'd like to comment on the very real and dangerous idea of the heropreneur. A mate of mine, Chris, recently attended a future thinking course in Brisbane, and at the end of the course, the convener asked the group to split into those who were optimistic about the future and those who were pessimistic about the future. Chris found himself with 3 other people in the pessimist group, and about 30 people were in the optimist camp. When the convener asked the optimists why they were optimistic, one person said, 'Because Jesus will save us.' In parentheses, Heinz has, this was Queensland after all. Another said that someone like Elon Musk will save us, and a third said that artificial intelligence will save us. At this point, Chris interrupted and said that these responses were why he was pessimistic, because Jesus, Elon Musk, or the best artificial intelligence in the universe would most likely tell us that we need to change our behavior, and none of you optimists are prepared to change your behavior to solve the multiple problems we face. I've told this story to many people, and when I get to the end, they just look at the ground in an embarrassed way and say nothing. I can only assume that they too realize that the solution is behavior change, but they just aren't prepared to do it, even if it means giving their kids the same quality of life and opportunities that we have had. One friend told me, after some thought, that before he heard this story, he was on the optimist side, but is now firmly in the pessimist camp. Of course, behavior change doesn't just mean recycling, composting, and turning the lights out. It must also include who you vote for, because there are some damaging processes at work that the individual can only affect through the ballot box. Keep up the great work. I look forward to my monthly dose of the Growth Busters podcast. Well, thank you, Heinz. And I must say that we rarely go a full month between episodes. We're really trying hard to do an episode every 2 weeks, so I hope you don't overdose. I hope you're glad to overdose, perhaps. Anyway, I just thought that was such an interesting story. I couldn't not share it. And if you haven't listened yet to episode 26, that should make you even more curious to go back and listen. All right, now to the main event. I invited Michael Brownlee to join me today and share about his newest book, Taking Back Our Food Supply: How to Lead the Local Food Revolution to Reclaim a Healthy Future. There's some pretty disconcerting news in this podcast about the future of our food supply. Now, we don't do conspiracy theories here, and I have a ton of respect for Brownlee, so you're going to want to listen to this. He's the guy who introduced the transition movement to the U.S., and he's been pioneering the movement to relocalize our food supply for something like a decade. He's a real pioneer. I think you'll find this discussion very enlightening. Be sure to check the show notes for links to the book and other noteworthy items in this discussion. Michael Brownlee, author of the new book, Taking Back Our Food Supply: How to Lead the Local Food Revolution to Reclaim a Healthy Future. Thanks a lot for joining me today.
Thank you, Dave. Great to be with you.
Can you give us a quick history of Michael Brownlee? Why should we look to you for advice and guidance on this subject?
Oh, it could turn out to be ill-advised, but my partner and I, Lynette Marie Hanthorn, and I have been involved sort of on the front lines of the local food movement here in Boulder County in Colorado for nearly 14 years now. And we have during that time had a large nonprofit organization supporting the development of local food in not just in Boulder County but in Colorado. And in 2016 we put together and published a book called The Local Food Revolution, which was published by North Atlantic Books in Berkeley, that sort of brought together all of our experience and learning about building local food systems. So I'd say that the biggest reason I can give to people for paying attention to what I'm saying in this book is that we've been at this for a long time. We've learned a lot. We've made a lot of mistakes along the way, and we think that we can be helpful.
That's about as good a credentials as anyone can have these days, right? Because I don't think anybody's got a master's or a doctorate in the local food revolution.
Well, they're starting to show up, actually. There are a few schools that are very innovative in that respect, but no, the only real credentials are on-the-ground experience.
Well, you mentioned your first book about local food, The Local Food Revolution. Was that the Old Testament, and Taking Back Our Food Supply is the New Testament?
Well, it was more that it was an attempt to take everything that we had learned about this and put it into book form, and it turned out to be a huge book. I mean, it was over 400 pages long, which is just too much for almost anyone to read.
It was a lot. It took a real commitment, and I can't remember how long it took me. I think it took me over a month to get through it.
Yeah, it's a significant read. So it's sort of the Encyclopedia Britannica of food localization.
So is that why this second book was needed, or are there other reasons for doing the second book?
We needed different avenues for getting into this conversation, certainly, but since that first book was published, it was published in the fall of 2016, which meant that, that book was 4 years in development, nearly. So by the time it was published, there was much that had happened in the local food movement and much that had happened in the world that needed to be addressed. So that led to quickly doing another book about food localization, the need for it, and how people could start to get involved in it.
So if you read The Local Food Revolution, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't read Taking Back Our Food Supply.
Not at all. It would mean that you would absolutely need to read Taking Back Our Food Supply and get involved with helping to develop a local food revolution.
Now, someone who is about to read Taking Back Our Food Supply, would you advise some of those readers that they might want to go back and read The Local Food Revolution? How do they determine whether they need to go back to that bigger piece?
We'd certainly recommend it.
Okay.
Yeah. So part of what we've developed since I started writing Taking Back Our Food Supply is the Local Food Academy, which is an online course for people who are called to the work of developing local food systems in their own area. And that course takes people through the book in depth, and in fact it expands the first book, and it expands many areas of that book. So we're learning all the time. We're adding new material. And so the Local Food Academy and the new book, Taking Back Our Food Supply, are some of the places where the new material can become available.
Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about the Local Food Academy if you would like later on. This may come as a surprise to you, but millions of people are listening to this podcast. So out of those millions, and I'm just kidding, don't we wish?
I'm saying, hooray!
Yeah, one of these days. But not everyone who's listening probably ought to read this book. Who needs to read this book? How do they self-select here?
That's a really good question. This book is written for people who are somehow finding themselves called to the issue of local food, not just eating local food, but have an interest or a drive towards helping to build local food systems, or actually localizing our food supply, taking it back from the global industrialized food system, which now controls actually more than 99% of our food supply in this country.
Well, it's clear from reading the book that you're very fond of the global industrial food system and have lunch at McDonald's every day. What's wrong? What's wrong with the current system?
Well, the industrial food system that has grown up really since World War II is, it is the largest industry on the planet, from end to end, growing food in the ground to processing and marketing and distribution, all of that, the whole system. It is the largest industry in the world. It is the greatest contributor to global warming. It is the primary cause of our predicament today, and yet it remains mostly invisible as such a cause. One of the things about this is that, Julian Cribb, an Australian journalist, revealed in a book a few years ago that of all the deaths that occur in the U.S., in Europe, and in Australia and New Zealand, more than half of them are as a result of food. So the truth is that our industrial food system is actually killing us. And this should be front page news every day, but it isn't. And people do not know. And so what's happened is that our food supply, which, less than 100 years ago was 100% local, 100% organic, essentially, has been hijacked by an alliance of global corporations, multinational corporations, big food, big ag, big pharma, big health even, supported by big banking and big government. And that alliance we've come to call the unholy alliance, because they are right at the heart of the predicament that we find ourselves in as a species today.
That's amazing to think that as recently as just 100 years ago, We hadn't fouled up our food system yet.
Yeah, and like many things, this has happened on our watch. And we didn't notice that this was happening. We didn't understand what it meant until just very recently. And so now we find, in an agricultural state like Colorado, something less than 2% of our food supply in Colorado actually comes from Colorado. Really astonishing. How did that happen without us noticing this?
Yeah. I'm going to jump around a little bit here.
Sure.
None of us like the way animals are treated in CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations.
Yeah.
But you make in the book, and you've made it before, the surprising observation that human civilization today is a CAFO, and we are the animals.
Essentially, yes. I mean, especially if you look at our cities. Cities are like big industrial feedlots. You could view them as the way that the industrial food system has organized people to be the most efficient method of feeding people, exactly the diet that they want to feed us, and making maximum profit off of all of that. And we have unconsciously and mostly, we think, happily gone along with this program.
Yeah.
And it is devastating. And so to begin to look at our cities, especially as CAFOs, I mean, it's really shocking. I can remember a couple of years ago, one of our most outstanding urban farmers in Denver and I were having a conversation, and I mentioned this. Denver is just a big CAFO for the industrial food system, and her eyes just went wide, and she just stopped in her tracks for maybe a full minute, and she said, "You're absolutely right, and I've never noticed it before." And here's someone who's deeply involved in this. Once you start seeing it, and how the global industrial food system, the unholy alliance, has built an enormous infrastructure that supports this, including the healthcare system, which is wrongly named. It should be called a death care system. It's a pretty insidious picture that we start to get. And what's painful to me about that is how this happened without us noticing it until just very recently.
Yeah, boy, we tend to do that to ourselves. And speaking of that, a lot of the conversation about food today seems to be revolving around how we need to eliminate food waste and engineer a second green revolution to feed the 4 billion addition to world population that the UN population scenario considered most likely is telling us. Is this where we're going?
Oh boy, so that's a long conversation. There are many parts of that. Just to touch on the issue of food waste, I think one of the important things to say about this is that the food system that we have is not broken, as many people say, because it's been designed this way. It's been designed intentionally over decades. And it works very well, it's very efficient. And waste, the whole issue of waste of food is built into that system. So that system is not interested in reducing food waste. It's part of the program.
Okay.
So, trying to reduce food waste is trying to change the system, which is not going to be very effective.
Change the system that we need to throw away rather than just tweak.
We need to create a completely different system. We need to stop participating in the current system and build regional, localized food systems. That's where we need to be going.
But what about the other part of that question that I think is even more important, which is this clamoring and wringing hands over, we've got to feed, and we've got to figure out a way to feed 11 billion people who are all going to want to eat meat. Is that what you're trying to do with relocalizing our food system?
Well, it's a complicated question. First of all, the way that it's framed these days is very misleading. The Green Revolution was not a bottom-up revolution, but it was a top-down coup that took over the way that food is produced, especially in third world countries. And one of the impacts of that, by design, I would say, was a radical increase in human population. It's a very effective way of growing human population so that you can sell them more of your product, right? In these CAFOs.
It wasn't really very green at all. I mean, wasn't that really a lot of the industrialization that took place was in order to create all that food?
Right, which replaced the very localized smallholder farming that was taking place in many of the countries that were revolutionized by the Green Revolution. So, it's very effective propaganda now for the industrial food system to say we have to ramp up the industrialization of our food supply to feed all of these people that are being produced by the industrial food system. And not only are they being produced in larger numbers, but they're being made ill so that the so-called healthcare system can grow as well. I mean, it's pretty insidious.
Well, for many people, I think eating a meal is kind of like filling up the car with gas. It's just a necessary part of life. Get the food to me, make it inexpensive, make it convenient, have a drone deliver it to my front door. You have more reverence for food. What makes food sacred? Why is it different than gas or electricity?
Well, if we think about it, food is the essence of life. It is how life is made possible. And what's happened with the industrialization of our food supply is that food has been turned into a commodity. We think about it very little. We think very little about what's in our food or where it's come from or how it's been produced. What that's done is it's disconnected us from the whole spectrum of life that makes food possible. The food that we're eating is not real food, and so what we miss is the connection with the sacredness of life, which has been at the core of human civilization, from the very beginning. And this is part of a larger loss of the sacredness in our global civilization today. But what becomes essential as we become aware of this is to make food sacred again, and learn how to connect with the sacred within our food supply. And that's going to mean changing how we eat, where we eat, how we cook, who we eat with, all of that. There's a whole world of experience of the sacred that we have lost touch with, which we can now begin to rediscover, which is a great joy in life.
I think we're going to have to slow down to do that.
Slowing down it's a bit of a conundrum. We need to slow down really quickly. Yeah, certainly we need to shift the way that we're living. We need to get off the train of the industrialization of our food system, the industrialization of our lives, and begin to become conscious of the earth that we're living on, become conscious of the living systems that we are part of.
Why do we need to do this so quickly?
Well, we've just about run out of time, with most especially the radical acceleration of global warming and the mass extinction of species on the planet today, we see that one of the most vulnerable parts of the way that we live in the world is our food supply, which will be greatly threatened and radically reduced by global warming and its attendant impacts like pest pressure, desertification, loss of soil. We have been learning from climate scientists who are paying attention to this aspect, and there are only a handful of them in the world who are looking at the impacts of global warming on the food supply, for instance, who are beginning to say now that for every degree Celsius increase in global temperature, we will lose 10% of our food supply, meaning our capacity to grow food.
Now, for our U.S. audience who probably, never has been able to embrace the metric system, 1 degree, 1 degree Celsius is what? Is that 1.7 or almost 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit?
Yeah, between 1.7 and 1.8 degrees. Yeah.
Okay. I always try to bring that up because I think, all the scientists talk in Celsius, and I think it sort of lulls Americans into complacency because they just sort of assume we're talking about Fahrenheit when we're not.
I agree, yeah. But even if it were Fahrenheit, there are many scientists who are now saying that we can expect a 4 to 6 degrees increase Celsius in temperature by 2050. Even if that was Fahrenheit, it would still be a lot. But it's Celsius, which means that, that's 4 to 6 degrees, that's something like 8 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit that we will likely see by 2050.
Now that's shocking, yeah.
Yeah, so that could reduce the planet's capacity to grow food by as much as 50%, over the next 31 growing seasons. I mean, that's how short a time we have. Actually, we don't have 31 growing seasons to build localized food systems because we're already seeing the reduction of food production capacity globally because of global warming.
But those temperatures you're talking about are bigger numbers and sooner than we've been reading in the mainstream media.
Yeah, mainstream media has not been doing a very good job of covering the story. More recently, we've had some very good journalists covering the story, people like Dar Jamail with his new book, The End of Ice, David Wallace Wells, his new book, The Uninhabitable Earth, that is getting a lot of attention. It was just published very recently, and he's finally gotten to the point where he's telling the story in a way that's getting people's attention. And the first line of his book is, "It's worse, far worse than you think." And that's just the beginning of the conversation. Yeah. It is far worse than almost any of us have thought, including our scientists who are having a hard time keeping up with all the data.
Yeah, I think you wrote in the book that the International Panel on Climate Change they're really kind of soft pedaling the news. They're being pretty cautious in their forecasts.
Well, they have failed to include in their projections the positive feedback loops that are being generated by global warming. They have failed to take into account what's happening in the Arctic, and they've just begun paying attention to that. So their data, besides being skewed to the conservative anyway, because what they publish requires consensus of all their scientists, is several years behind what we now understand is happening. So they're very late, and unfortunately, because they're quoted so much in the press, they're giving us a very misleading picture of what's actually happening with global warming.
So this situation means that we are not going to be able to feed 11 billion people by the end of this century. In fact, it sounds to me like we're not going to be able to feed 7 billion people in 30 years.
I think that that's accurate. I mean, if you look at the trajectory of the impact on the food supply of just global warming, we can see we will not be reaching population levels of 10 or 11 billion people by 2050, or even, we'll never get to that level. Because what we're facing with the impact of global warming on our food supply is within years, we're going to be seeing famine, widespread famine in the world, because we are not producing enough food for the people that currently exist. Mm-hmm. People will be dying of starvation, even in this country. Dr. David Battisti, who's chair of the Atmospheric Sciences Department up at the University of Washington, he has been maybe the leading scientist in the world who's been helping us to understand where we're going with all of this, what kind of impact we're going to be seeing. And he points out that the areas of the world that will be the hardest hit and hit first will be the breadbasket regions of the world, including the Midwest right here in the U.S. He's a very cautious scientist, and he doesn't make many projections. He lays out all of the principles and the facts and allows us to connect the dots ourselves, which I greatly appreciate. But it's clear that we're going to be seeing the outbreak of mass starvation in the United States within years. How many years? Could be a decade, could be a little bit more, but no more than 15 years or so. And so for those of us who are aware that that's what's headed our way, it places huge responsibility on us, because we know that we need to prepare for that. And that right now, nobody is having that conversation. For instance, here in Colorado, there's not a meeting that you can go to anywhere in Colorado where this is being discussed. No one is planning for this. So we must begin planning for this on a local level, beginning locally, and then expanding that out to regionally.
So the global industrial food system sucks anyway, and so we really needed to make this shift to relocalizing our food system anyway. But there's a little more urgency attached to it because of the fact that the industrial food system is going to fail because of climate change.
It is going to fail. It is already failing. We're already seeing reduction of crop output. That's already beginning. We're seeing greatly reduced nutritional value of crops that are raised in industrial methods. They're not going to be able to rise to the occasion. They're going to try to take advantage of the situation. Like the oil industry, they will probably continue to make significant profits over the next 2 or 3 decades, but they will not be able to produce the amount of food that they're even producing now by mid-century.
So we need to relocalize our food system. That's pretty easy. We just need to go to farm dinners, spend more time shopping at the farmer's market, and whole paycheck. Problem solved, right?
I wish it was that easy. One of the challenges is that local food, organic food, all of that has become seen as a lifestyle movement primarily. It's an option available especially to people with a bit more income than most, and it's become very popular in that regard. But very, very few people understand that it's actually necessary. It's a matter of life and death to build our own local, regional food systems, or we will not have a food supply. I mean, it's just that simple.
And it's not as simple as, I basically just repeated the mythology that's grown up around that, right?
Yeah.
That's not what you're talking about.
No, it's very complicated because the global industrial food system has so dominated our economy. It's certainly dominated our land base. So to begin to do something outside of that is very difficult. Land is now extremely expensive, and that all goes to making it almost impossible for farmers growing local organic food to make a living doing that. Only a handful of them are making a decent living. Most of them, something on the order of at least 80% of our farmers involved in all of this have to work jobs off the farm in order to be able to afford to farm.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to begin to re-engineer our local economies to support local food production and local food consumption. And that's a really big and radical change that will take huge amounts of public education. And for all of that to work, this is what, where we're getting to in the local food movement now is we're discovering that while we can build farms, we can increase their productivity, we can build farmers markets, we can build CSAs, and all of that can seem very, very vibrant. All of that cannot grow very much until we build an infrastructure for processing, for distribution and marketing. And we have no infrastructure for all of that for local food right now. So we have to build that. We're beginning to do it, but we're learning that it requires just enormous amounts of capital. And maybe even more challenging, it requires just extraordinary cooperation and collaboration among farmers and producers and buyers and consumers. These are very new ways of thinking and working for most of us.
And can I say accurately that this book doesn't lay out the full prescription? You don't pretend to have all the answers and know all the steps we need to be taking.
Certainly not. In many ways, nobody knows how to do this. But what the book and what the Local Food Academy lays out instead is an understanding of the process by which food localization can naturally occur. This is an evolutionary process. It's not even one. I think it's worth considering that we humans are not inventing this. You could say that the universe itself or evolution itself is implementing a course correction on our planet right now, and that the local food revolution is right on the front lines of that. So those of us who are involved have this incredible opportunity to be a part of this and learn how to align with and cooperate with and support this evolutionary course correction that is just beginning to take hold, but it's beginning almost everywhere. You can see signs of it everywhere. But we're in the very early stages of it.
And your advice to someone who thinks they may be a local food catalyst is, you say it in the book that you're advising a very different kind of activism than you think we've been practicing. I'm practically quoting you here. And that I think that the typical local food champion might be likely to try. You wrote, "Activism as it has been known during the Holocene epoch is a distorted attempt at command and control to make things happen. This is not the way of the evolutionary catalyst who must learn to align with and embody the evolutionary force itself." So it's going to be hard enough as it is, but you're actually advising us that we really have to kind of rethink our ways and be a little more patient, even though there's some urgency here.
Yes, that's right. So When we got started, in this work back in 2005, and really started focusing on foods almost exclusively by 2006, we thought that we could get to 25% local food in Colorado, in a decade or so. That seemed an achievable goal, a little ambitious maybe, but doable. And so we began working in that direction. And so in nearly 14 years now, we can look back and see that with all of the effort that's gone on in Colorado, we have moved the needle almost none at all.
Yeah.
We're still below 2% local food. So we began shifting our time frame, and we realized that the building of localized regional food systems is not going to happen in a few years. This has to be built in a very careful way with a long-term view. This is going to take generations. It's not going to happen in our lifetimes, but we begin now, and it's going to be a rough road ahead. But those places where this has begun will have the best chance of being fairly resilient as we go through a very difficult time on this planet, which we're now increasingly calling the Anthropocene epoch, which is sort of the new dark ages of our time, the corner that we have painted ourselves into as a result of the global proliferation of an industrialized civilization that is having a devastating effect on our biosphere and a devastating effect on human existence as well.
And there's no way we're going to avoid these dark ages, right?
No, we're in for a very rough time. I mean, we're certainly not going to solve global warming. We're not going to solve mass extinction of species. We're going to have to go through these things. And the places that are building localized regional food systems can actually be lifeboats for the people in those regions as we go through this time of very stormy seas. And that time will not last forever. I mean, there is another side to the Anthropocene, what Thomas Berry spoke of as the Ecozoic epoch, when humanity finally arrives at a level of species maturity where we're actually living in co-creative harmony with nature, with the biosphere, with each other, and with the universe itself, which includes the sacred and the spiritual, which our industrial civilization has done its best to push off the map. We have to rediscover all of these things as we go through the Anthropocene. So we're building lifeboats in localized regional food systems.
It does sound pretty dark, but there's light at the end of the tunnel.
There is light. It's the exciting thing, though, is that as we rediscover the systems of life on this planet, as we reconnect with all of that, as we reconnect with the sacred and the spiritual, life, it lights up for us in ways that we have been desperately missing in our society. And so those who are involved in this work are, even though they know that we're in for very difficult times ahead, the hardest work that any of us have ever done before, that we are fully engaged. We know that this is the work that we came here to do. There's nothing more important for us or for the planet. So we can give of ourselves without reservation. without hesitation. Even knowing that we will probably not see the visible fruits of this within our lifetimes. But we are building towards, the arising of something new out of the ashes of the dying industrial civilization.
Now, I'm thinking that we didn't quite fully answer this question that I thought I would ask now. But if you did, forgive me for asking it a second time. But, every community has its share of what I would call local food champions, people who really believe in local food and are really trying to make it happen. But not all of those people are local food catalysts, if I understand your thinking. Is that fair to say that a small subset of them are the people that you're trying to identify and inspire here?
I would say that they all are potentially.
Okay.
And the shift that has to happen, part of what's happened in the environmental movement, the sustainability movement, is the focus has been on our own individual lives, our lifestyles. And here in Boulder, for instance, we hear lots of people talking about, my sustainable lifestyle, with great pride, without having any sense of the systems that we're living in. We need to learn how to think systemically. That doesn't happen just accidentally. We have to learn. That's one of the great benefits for people who are studying permaculture, for instance. We're understanding how life works on this planet. So we start to open up to a much more systemic view. So when we start to think increasingly in terms of bioregions, we can start to see how highly localized regional food systems can emerge and how we can be involved in that. But if all we're focused on is, my diet, my lifestyle, my family, we will never get there. So we're reaching out to all of those people who are attracted in any way by local food, health, sustainability, wellness, all of that, because they're all potentially first responders to a planetary emergency and catalysts for an evolutionary course correction on the planet.
So if all of these candidates are potentially local food catalysts, then it might be a good idea for them to explore the Local Food Academy, and they'll either become catalysts or they'll discover in that process, well, maybe that's not my role, maybe, worst case.
That's right. That's right. So the book, Taking Back Our Food Supply, is, you could think of it as a recruiting tool. I mean, we are actively looking for those people who are ready to step into the role of being what we call local food catalysts in the areas where they live. So hopefully the book will get their attention. They will be interested in exploring the Local Food Academy, where they're not just learning about this, but they're engaged with a growing community of local food catalysts internationally, who are learning together and learning from each other in this very long process of localizing our food supply to the greatest extent we can, as quickly as we can.
Now, if someone wants to attend the Local Food Academy, they don't need to relocate to Boulder, where they will be on this massive campus, right?
No, this is an online course that takes place over 10 to 12 weeks. And it's a weekly session with a lot of homework in between sessions. And then about every 3 months, we do what we call a First Responders Convergence here in Boulder, 3.5-day event where people can go much deeper and help build this community together.
And I just want to say I'm looking forward to attending one of these convergences.
We are looking forward to your being there.
That will be very enlightening, I think.
You are one of the people who are greatly needed. You've been preparing for decades for this time in which you can make a greater level of contribution than you ever have before.
This book was published with another title at first, wasn't it?
It was called Reclaiming the Future, How to Lead the Local Food Revolution in Your Community.
So now it has a new title. It's not a second edition or anything?
No, it's the only thing that's changed is the title. And that was at the suggestion of the print publisher, Morgan James Publishing in New York.
Okay. But we will include links in the show notes to help people find the book and to help people get more information about the local food academy and sign up if they want to do that.
The main thing about Taking Back Our Food Supply as a publication is that it is beginning around Earth Day. It will be distributed in print in bookstores. So that makes it available to a lot more people. It makes it visible to a lot more people. And that's why we went with this particular publisher, because that's what they could offer. We can publish ebooks, no problem, but to have a New York publisher behind getting it in bookstores, it makes it a different ballgame.
Yeah, that's quite an accomplishment. There's so many books these days that don't end up on the shelves of the bookstores.
Yeah, and we'll see what happens. Print is a very difficult medium these days without putting lots and lots of money into marketing, which we're certainly not going to do. This needs to be spread primarily by word of mouth. We started making this book available as an ebook just about a year ago. So that's what you're seeing on Goodreads and Amazon. That's still there. It'll probably get taken down in the next few months. It takes a long time to write a book, and actually this one was written quickly. It was written over an 8-week period in the fall of 2017. That's nearly a year and a half ago, when that was written.
Yeah, I was going to mention that we're recording this podcast in early March of 2019, because somebody may discover this in 2025. Who knows?
Yeah, exactly. So in a year and a half, we've learned a lot more about our predicament, especially as it relates to global warming. As David Wallace Wells, it's far worse than you think, and even what we have thought. And so the level of urgency has greatly increased since this book was first made available as an ebook. That's part of the problem in the publishing world. It takes years to write a book. It takes years generally to get it published. And by the time it's finally available to people, it's out of date. That's part of what we face. So that's why there's not a lot of just facts and figures in this book. But we're talking about principles and processes which are really timeless.
There you go. Well, and I want to mention, I've been a longtime fan of your work, Michael, and if other listeners like what they're hearing and want to hear more of your thinking, I thought I'd mention that I interviewed you a couple of years ago for 2 episodes of the syndicated radio series Conversation Earth.
Yes.
And those episodes are out there. So if you want to hear those conversations, just search for the Conversation Earth podcast and Michael Brownlee to find those in your podcast app, or follow the links that I'll put in the show notes for that, or you can just find them on the web by heading over to conversationearth.org.
That would be great.
What else? Is there anything else that you really want the listeners today to take away that I haven't given you a chance to pontificate on?
Well, one of the questions that we hear from people who are concerned about what's going on in the world is, of course, well, what can I do? This is a place to start. To get involved in localizing our food system. And everybody can become involved in that and support that process. So, we tried to make this book as accessible as possible. It's a very brief book. It's pretty easy to read. It's just an invitation to go deeper into the conversation with us. And we just really look forward to connecting with the people who find themselves called in some often very mysterious ways by this issue. And we think that people will be surprised and delighted and inspired by what they read, in spite of the very obvious bad news that we're facing.
That's quite a feat. And I think you may have accomplished that with this book, so bravo.
We hope so.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Michael, for investing your time, all of the time, well over a decade that you've invested trying to figure out what the building blocks are for relocalizing our food system, and the time that you've invested in writing these books and developing the local food economy, and for spending nearly an hour with me today on this podcast. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Dave. It's really a privilege to be able to talk about this with you. And I was thinking, we're really not trying to figure this out. We're trying to discover what the earth is actually asking of us in this situation, and how we can learn to respond to that. That's really the essence of this work.
Real quickly, I want to give a shout out to one of my favorite nonprofits in the sustainable living arena, Having Kids, and recommend the forum they're hosting in Washington, D.C. on April 9th, 2019, Tackling the Population Taboo, Creating a Sustainable Future for Children. The forum is free to attend, so head over to havingkids.org or see the show notes for a link to this forum. And be sure to follow the Overpopulation podcast for a post-forum report and some of the content from that forum in the following weeks or months. Also, a quick note about some upcoming free Earth Day screenings of my documentary, Growthbusters: Hooked on Growth. The film will screen in Colorado Springs on April 8th at 7 p.m. at the Tim Gill Center for Public Media. It's hosted by the Independent Film Society of Colorado, and here's a bonus. It will feature a panel discussion following the film with yours truly, plus a sitting city councilor and a representative of the real estate development industry. In Pittsboro, North Carolina, Growthbusters will screen on April 23rd at the Chatham Community Library. Thank you to the Chatham Community Library for organizing that. You can find info on these events on the Growthbusters Facebook page and the Growthbusters Movie Facebook page, or look for links in the show notes for this episode. All right, don't forget to explore the issues at growthbusters.org. And if you think this podcast is important, recommend it to a friend. Subscribe to the podcast on your podcast app, and rate the podcast over at Apple Podcasts or iTunes, and give us a review. These things will help other people discover the Growthbusters podcast. And the more people who listen, the more people we might have living sustainably. If you want to see the Growthbusters documentary and you can't make the screenings in North Carolina or Colorado, it's easy enough to find on Amazon or at growthbustersmovie.org. And you know what? You can also organize a screening in your community. You can always email me at podcast@growthbusters.org, and I can help you get that going if you like. Thanks for listening, and importantly, thank you for your interest and efforts to live sustainably.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather, but no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling.